Frame rate is simply how many individual images your camera captures every single second when you're recording. Now there are four main types of frame rates you can choose from 24, 30, 60, and 120 plus. And they all have their different purposes. And knowing which one of them to use can make the difference between a well-made video and one that looks very amateurish. So in this video, I'm gonna go over each frame rate and when you should use each one in your video. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a better grasp on what frame rate you should use in what situations. So the first frame rate we're gonna look at is 24 frames per second. The one thing you're gonna notice when you go into your camera settings is that you might not actually see 24 frames per second listed. What you might see instead is 23.976, or sometimes it's just set as 23.97. 23.97 and true 24 frames per second aren't exactly the same thing. The difference is about one frame every 41 seconds, which sounds pretty insignificant. And if you are shooting just for YouTube or anything on social media, it pretty much is insignificant. So for the purposes of this video, we will treat them as basically the exact same thing. Now on to when you should use 24 frames per second. This is considered the cinematic frame rate, and its origin goes back to the 1920s. Studios needed a frame rate that was fast enough to produce a video, but also slow enough that it can keep costs low when film first started out. So if this was the technique used in the 1920s, why are we still talking about it today? Well, after about 100 years of watching movies in 24 frames per second, our brains have been conditioned to associate cinematic footage with 24 frames per second, because even to this day, that's what movies are still shot in. So even if you're not shooting a movie, when should you use 24 frames per second in your videos? And that really just comes down to your preference. If you're just shooting a casual vlog, a talking head video like this one, or anything where the visuals aren't really the main focus, I would probably go with a higher frame rate like 30 FPS, which we'll go over in a minute. But if you're someone who puts a lot of time and effort into your visuals and you're thinking about your composition, the lighting, and you know how to color grade, then I would definitely recommend 24 frames per second because it's going to give you that little extra edge you need to make your videos look truly cinematic. Overall, if you're just making a vlog or anything like that, shooting at 24 frames per second will not look bad by any means, but you might have some more benefits when it comes to shooting in 30 FPS. If you clicked on this video hoping to find kind of like a default frame rate, kind of like one size fits all thing, then 30 FPS is probably the one to go with. 30 frames per second, or 29.97 frames, is the standard for online video content. And if you throw your camera on 30 FPS and just never change it, your videos will all look fine. And just like 23.9 versus 24 frames per second, 29.9 and 30 frames per second are not technically the same thing, but for the purposes of this video, we're gonna act like they are. Because if you're just using them for YouTube or social media, they basically are the same thing. The reason we have 30 FPS originally came from TV in North America. It was established at 30 FPS because it synced up nicely with the frequency that we use to broadcast our video in the US. So most things that you watch on TV have been 30 frames per second. So when should you actually be using 30 frames per second in your videos? Well, if you're shooting pretty much any type of video, like a vlog, talking head like this one, or basically any sort of casual video you just want to throw online, you should probably just use 30 frames per second. It's the safest option, and with those 6 extra frames that help you in editing, you have a little bit of smoother motion if you're to slow something down for a bit. And it plays back well on most major platforms. It's what people use pretty much every day. So unless you're going for a super cinematic vlog feel, using 30 frames per second is gonna be your best bet for online content. Real quick before we get going, if you're a video editor or photographer yourself and have unused video, photos, or motion graphics just sitting on your hard drive, you should go check out creatorrestock.com. It's a stock media marketplace where you can upload your unused assets and earn 60% of the subscription revenue for content that you uploaded that you weren't even gonna use anyways. It's completely free to join, so if you wanna make a little bit of extra income, go check out the link in my description. Our next frame rate is 60 FPS. So 60 FPS is where things get a little bit different because you technically could just film your entire video in 60 frames per second, but I would highly recommend you don't. I've seen people do this on YouTube a lot, but in my opinion, the video looks pretty bad when shot in 60 frames per second. It's really smooth and there's little motion blur to it, and it kind of gives it an unnatural feel because we're used to seeing motion blur, not only just in videos, but just in the real world with our eyes as well. So if 60 frames per second looks bad, then when should you ever shoot in it? Well, you should really only shoot in it if you're planning on slowing down that footage. The way slow motion works is that if you try to slow something down in post, say your video is 30 frames per second, so that means there's 30 frames to work with. If you slow it down by 50%, your software now has to fill those frames that weren't there originally. It does this by stretching out each frame to twice its length, and that leads to really choppy looking slow motion footage. However, if your video was shot in 60 frames per second and you wanted to slow it down by the same time, about 50%, it will have double the amount of frames to work with. So instead of having to stretch each frame out, you can use those extra frames you got to smoothly slow down your footage to 30 frames per second without it looking choppy. So you really only want to use 60 frames per second when you're wanting to slow something down in post. It can still work as a full video at 60 frames per second, but in my opinion, it just looks a little bit too smooth and unnatural, and I would stay away from it. And then that brings us to our final frame rate, which is 120 frames per second or anything higher. 120 frames per second or anything higher is a little bit different from the last 3 frame rates we've looked at. 120 FPS is not suitable for an entire video by itself, like how 60 frames per second could be. 120 frames per second is exclusively used for slow motion footage. The math works basically the same way as we talked about with the 60 frames per second, except now you have double the frames to work with, so you can slow it down even more. Now, the trade-off with this is that not every camera is capable of 120 frames per second, and the ones that do often come with limitations. A lot of cameras will drop you down to a lower resolution when you switch to 120 frames per second, or they'll reduce the bit rate, which means less quality in the image. So before you go shooting all your slow motion in 120 frames per second, make sure to check your camera settings and make sure it's actually worth doing so and it's not going to mess up the continuity of your video. So when should you actually use 120 FPS over 60? And I think it really depends how slow you want your footage and your camera capabilities. 60 frames per second is pretty natural movement still. Like I said, you can just film your whole video in it and it'll look alright enough. But 120 FPS is for really slow footage. So it really kind of depends how much you want to emphasize the slow motion. If you just want kind of a very light, subtle slow motion to your video, then I would shoot 60. But if you want something really slow and dramatic, I would shoot at 120 plus. And those are the 4 main frame rates you should be looking at. To recap, 24 frames per second is for a sign of a cinematic film look. 30 frames per second is for just everyday online content. 60 frames per second is for a little bit of slow motion, and 120 frames per second is for a really dramatic slow motion shot. At the end of the day, the right frame rate is one that matches what you're trying to create, so there's no universally right answer to choose from. And if you found this video helpful, make sure to subscribe because I post videos like this every single week to help you become a better video creator. And if you have any specific topics you want me to cover, make sure to drop it in the comment below, and then make sure to check out creatorrestock.com in the link below, and I'll see you in the next video.